The dust swirled through the main street of Copper Ridge like a restless spirit, and in the center of it all stood a man who defied every expectation this frontier town had ever held. While the local folks wore practical boots and sturdy work clothes, this stranger sported colorful silk scarves, leather pants with intricate stitching, and most shocking of all, he was walking on his hands down the middle of Main Street, his legs gracefully arched over his like he was born upside down. This was Marco Santelli, a traveling acrobat whose reputation preceded him like morning thunder. But what the people of Copper Ridge didn't know was that in the next 24 hours, Marco would save their mayor's daughter from certain doom, only to refuse a reward so generous and shocking that it would split the town right down the middle and force everyone to question what they thought they knew about honor, sacrifice, the true meaning of wealth. The morning sun painted the wooden storefront shades of gold as Marco finally flipped to his feet, dusting off his hands theatrical flair. A small crowd had gathered, their faces a mixture of amusement and bewilderment. Children peeked out from behind their mothers' skirts, wide-eyed at this visitor who seemed to move like water and bend like willow branches. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marco announced in a voice that carried the hint of a distant accent, perhaps Italian or Spanish, "I am Marco Santelli, and I bring you entertainment from the great cities of the East." He produced 3 red balls from seemingly nowhere and began juggling them in impossible pattern, the spheres tracing arcs that seemed to defy the very laws of nature. Old Pete, the blacksmith, spat tobacco juice into the dirt and shook his grizzled head. "Ain't natural, a grown man flipping about like that," he muttered. But even he couldn't look away as Marco caught all 3 balls behind his back without breaking his smile. What the crowd didn't notice was the way Marco's sharp eyes constantly scanned the surrounding buildings, the way his body remained balanced and ready despite his seemingly carefree performance. Years of traveling had taught him that trouble often wore the mask of curiosity, and in towns like this, strangers were either welcomed with open arms or met with barely concealed hostility. The performance was interrupted by the thundering of hooves as Mayor Cornelius Fairweather arrived on his pristine black stallion, his silver badge catching the morning light. The mayor was a man who commanded respect through presence alone, tall and broad-shouldered, with a carefully maintained mustache that spoke of both vanity and authority. Behind him rode his daughter, Elizabeth, a young woman of perhaps 20 years, whose independence was as well known as her beauty. Elizabeth Fairweather was not like other young ladies of the frontier. While her peers occupied themselves with sewing circles and preparations for advantageous marriages, she could handle a rifle better than most men, and had been known to ride alone to the neighboring settlements, much to her father's constant worry. Her auburn hair caught the wind as she dismounted, and Marco noticed the way she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had never known true fear. "What's all this commotion?" Mayor Fairweather boomed, his voice designed to carry authority across town squares and into the hearts of potential voters. His eyes fell upon Marco with the suspicious gaze of a man who had seen too many drifters bring trouble to his carefully maintained. Marco bowed deeply, a gesture that somehow managed to be both respectful and slightly mocking. "Mayor Fairweather, I presume? I am Marco Santelli, humble entertainer and performer of feats that will amaze and delight your fine citizen. I ask only for a small space to perform and perhaps a few coins from those who find joy in my art." The mayor's expression remained stern, but Elizabeth stepped forward, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Father, surely there's no harm in a bit of entertainment. When was the last time anything interesting happened in Copper Ridge?" This simple question would prove to be more prophetic than anyone could have imagined. Mayor Fairweather reluctantly agreed to allow the performance, but not without condition. "You can set up in the town square, but I want no drinking, no gambling, and no trouble. This is a respectable community, and we aim to keep it that way." Marco nodded agreeably, though those watching closely might have noticed the slight smile that played at the corners of his mouth. "Of course, Mayor. I am a man of peace and artistry. Violence has no place in my world." As the crowd dispersed to spread word of the evening's entertainment, Elizabeth lingered, studying Marco with the analytical gaze of someone accustomed to reading people. "You're not just an acrobat, are you?" Quiet, her voice pitched low enough that her father couldn't hear. Marco's juggling never faltered, but his eyes met hers with a new intensity. "What makes you say that, Miss Fairweather? The way you move, the way you watch everything around you. I've seen gunfighters and soldiers, and they all have that same awareness. You're ready for trouble even when you're performing. Before Marco could respond, Elizabeth had already turned to follow her father, leaving him alone with his juggling balls and a growing sense that this quiet frontier town might hold more surprises than he had anticipated. That evening, as the sun began its descent to the distant mountain, the entire population of Copper Ridge seemed to gather in the town square. Marco had constructed a simple stage using borrowed planks and barrels, and as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, he began a performance that would be talked about for years to come. He started with juggling, but not the simple three-ball routine from the morning. Instead, he juggled flaming torches, their orange light dancing across the mesmerized faces of the audience. Children gasped as the flames traced impossible patterns through the air, and even the most skeptical adults found themselves leaning forward in amazement. But the real spectacle began when Marco produced a length of rope with fluid movements that seemed almost supernatural. He coiled it around his body and then, impossibly, began to climb it even as it hung freely in the air with no visible support. The crowd fell silent as he ascended 20 feet above their heads, the rope somehow maintaining its rigidity despite defying every law of physics they understood. "How's he doing that?" whispered Mrs. Henderson, the schoolteacher, her usual composure completely abandoned. "Has to be some kind of trick," old Pete muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. From his elevated position, Marco had a clear view of the surrounding area, and it was then that he spotted something that made his blood run cold. In the shadows beyond the flickering torchlight, he could see the silhouettes of armed men positioning them around the town. The glint of metal in the moonlight told him all he needed to know. Without missing a beat in his performance, Marco began his descent, his mind racing to calculate odds and he had counted at least a dozen figures in the darkness, too many for one man to handle in a direct confrontation. But Marco Santelli had not survived years of traveling dangerous territories by relying on direct confrontation alone. As his feet touched the stage, the sound of gunfire erupted from the edge of town, not the controlled shots of celebration, but the rapid, desperate volleys of men under attack. The audience turned in confusion toward the sound, and it was then that the trap was sprung. Men in dark clothing emerged from the shadows surrounding the square, their faces hidden behind bandanas, their weapons drawn and ready. The leader, a tall man with cold eyes visible, stepped into the torchlight and raised his hand for silence. "Nobody moves, nobody gets hurt," he announced, devoid of it. "We're here for one thing only. Mayor Fairweather, you've got something that belongs to our employer, and we're here to collect." Mayor Fairweather stepped forward, his hand instinctively moving toward the weapon at his hip. But the sight of so many guns pointed at innocent townspeople made him freeze. "I don't know what you're talking about. State your business plainly." The leader's laugh was harsh and humorless. "Playing innocent won't work, Mayor. 3 months ago, a certain shipment of gold was supposed to pass through your jurisdiction on its way to San Francisco. That shipment never arrived at its destination, and our investigation has led us to believe it found a new home right here in Copper Ridge." Elizabeth stepped closer to her father, her face pale, determined. "Father, what is he talking about?" The mayor's silence spoke volumes, and the leader nodded with satisfaction. "That's right, Miss Fairweather. Your dear father has been hiding something from you and from this entire town. That gold wasn't just any shipment. It belonged to Senator Morrison's private transport, money intended for a railroad investment that would have brought prosperity, higher tier. Marco, standing on stage, found himself in a unique position to observe the entire scene. His performer's training had taught him to read crowds, to sense the shift in mood and energy, and what he sensed now was growing panic mixed with confusion. The townspeople were beginning to understand that they were caught in something much larger and more dangerous than a simple robbery. "The gold isn't here," Mayor Fairweather said finally, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "Even if what you're saying is true, I don't have access to any missing shipment." The leader's response was swift and brutal. With a gesture, 2 of his men grabbed Elizabeth, their rough hands pulling her away from her father despite her struggles. "Maybe your memory will improve when you have the proper motivation. You have until sunrise to produce that gold, or your daughter takes a very unpleasant trip with us to meet our employer." The mayor's composure finally cracked. "Wait! You can't take her. She has nothing to do with this. She has everything to do with this now. Sunrise, make your choice. As the bandits began to retreat with their captive, Elizabeth caught Marco's eye across the chaotic square. In that brief moment of connection, he saw not fear, but determination, and something else that surprised him: trust. Somehow this young woman who barely knew him was counting on him to act. Marco's decision was instantaneous. As the crowd milled about in confusion, and the mayor stood frozen by the impossible choice before him, the acrobat moved with the fluid grace that had amazed the audience just moments. But now, instead of entertainment, his movements had deadly purpose. He launched himself from the stage in a spinning leap that carried him over the heads of the confused townspeople. Landing silently behind the retreating bandits, he used the very skills that had made him a master performer to become something far more dangerous. The first bandit never knew what hit him. Marco's hand found the pressure point at the base of his neck, and the man dropped unconscious to the ground. The second turned just in time to see a red silk scarf whipping toward his face, temporarily blinding him long enough for Marco to disarm him with a quick strike to his wrist. But it was the rescue of Elizabeth that would later be told and retold around campfires throughout the territory. As the leader of the bandits turned his horse to flee with his captive, Marco produced a length of rope from his costume and, with movements too quick to follow, fashioned a lasso. But instead of throwing it at the horse or rider, he cast it upward toward the overhanging branch of an ancient oak tree at the edge of the... What happened next defied belief. Marco somehow used the rope to swing through the air like a circus, his body arcing through the darkness with impossible precision. He struck the bandit leader with both feet, knocking him from his horse, while simultaneously catching Elizabeth as she fell, bringing them both safely to the ground in a move that seemed to blend combat with choreography. The remaining bandits, seeing their leader defeated and their mission compromised, melted back into the darkness from which they had emerged, their retreat swift and silent as their arrival had been. As Elizabeth regained her footing, the town square erupted in cheers and applause. Marco found himself surrounded by grateful citizens, their earlier suspicion replaced by admiration and amazement. Mayor Fairweather pushed through the crowd, his face a mixture of relief and wonder. "Young man," the mayor said, his voice thick with emotion, "you have saved my daughter's life, and possibly the lives of everyone in this town. There are no words adequate to express my gratitude." Marco dusted off his colorful costume and shrugged with apparent nonchalance. "I am glad I could help, Mayor. A performer must always be ready to improvise when the script changes unexpectedly." But Elizabeth was studying the unconscious bandit leader with a thoughtful expression. "Father, we need to talk about what he said, about the gold." The mayor's face darkened. "Elizabeth, this is not the time or place for such discussion." "Actually," Marco interjected quietly, "I believe it is exactly the right time and place. These men will not give up so easily, and now that they know where to find you, they will return with greater numbers and fewer scruples about harming innocent people." The captured bandit leader was beginning to stir, and Old Pete, along with several other men, quickly bound him with rope. As consciousness returned, the man's eyes focused on Marco with a mixture of hatred and grudging respect. "Fight well for an entertainer. But this isn't over. My employer has resources you can't imagine, and he always collects what's owed to." "Who is your employer?" Kneeling beside the bound man, the bandit's laugh was bitter. "Someone who makes mayors and territorial governors dance to his tune. Someone who owns judges and sheriffs across 3 territories. You think this backwater town can hide forever?" Mayor Fairweather stepped forward, his face grave. "Citizens of Copper Ridge, I believe we need to discuss some difficult truths. Marco, would you join us? Your actions tonight have earned you the right to hear the full story." As the crowd gathered closer, drawn by the promise of explanations for the night's terrifying events, the mayor began to speak. His words would reveal a web of corruption and hidden wealth that reached far beyond their small frontier community. 3 months ago, the mayor began, I received word that a gold shipment bound for San Francisco had been attacked by bandits 20 miles south of here. The Army patrol escorting it had been removed from the situation, and the bandits themselves had been found eliminated by persons unknown. The gold wagon was discovered abandoned, its contents intact, but its intended destination no longer safe. Elizabeth stared at her father in shock. "You took the gold?" "I secured it," the mayor corrected firmly. The original owners were dead, the intended recipients were unknown to me, and leaving such wealth unguarded in bandit territory would have been an invitation for every outlaw gang in the territory to converge on our community. Old Pete scratched his beard thoughtfully. So, where is this gold now? The mayor hesitated, glancing around at the faces of his constituents. Hidden safely where it can do the most good for our community. That gold could fund a school, improve our defenses, maybe even attract the railroad to build a station here, instead of bypassing us for silver. Marco had remained silent during this exchange, but now he stepped forward. Mayor Fairweather, with respect, I believe you are not telling the complete truth. The crowd turned to stare at the acrobat, surprised by his boldness. Elizabeth's eyes narrowed as she studied Marco's expression. What do you mean? Marco reached into his colorful costume and produced a paper, yellowed and creased from travel. Before I arrived in Copper Ridge, I stopped in the territorial capital. There, I learned something very interesting about a missing gold shipment and the man who originally owned it. He unfolded the paper and held it so the torchlight illuminated the official look. This is a death certificate for Senator Morris, dated 4 months ago. He passed away from natural causes, leaving behind a will that donated his entire estate, including a substantial gold shipment en route to San Francisco, to the Territorial Orphanage Fund. The silence that followed was deafening. Mayor Fairweather's and Elizabeth stepped back from her father as if seeing him for the first. Those have been waiting for funds that could provide them with homes, education, medical. Father, Elizabeth's voice was steady but cold. Is this true? The mayor's shoulders sagged as the weight of truth became unbearable. I didn't know about the will at first. By the time I learned the truth, I had already committed to using the gold for our town's development. I told myself that our needs were just as legitimate, that we could do as much good here as any orphanage in the territorial capital. Old Pete spat again, but this time it was clearly an expression of disgust. So you've been sitting on orphans' money while preaching about moral leadership and community values? The crowd began to murmur. The sound was not friendly. Marco sensed the mood shifting dangerously and stepped forward to address the growing anger. Citizens of Copper Ridge, I understand your shock and disappointment, but we face a more immediate problem. The bandit leader mentioned an employer, someone with significant resources and political connection. Even if Mayor Fairweather were to return the gold immediately, that might not be enough to ensure your... Elizabeth turned to Marco, her eyes bright with unshed tears, her voice determined. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that we need to understand who we're really dealing with before we make any decisions. The gold, and I believe, glancing at Bandit, that our friend here might be willing to share more information if properly motivated. Ibaka, the bandit leader, who had been listening to the entire exchange with growing amusement, suddenly threw back his head and laughed. People have no idea how deep this goes. My employer isn't some territorial politician or cattle baron. He's the one who arranged for that gold to disappear in the first place. The crowd fell silent, absorbing this new revelation. Marco knelt beside the bound man, his voice deadly quiet. Explain. Yeah, Senator Morrison was supposed to die in an accident, not in his bed from natural causes. The gold was supposed to disappear permanently, not end up in some frontier town's treasury. My employer has been very patient, but patience has limits. Elizabeth gasped. You're saying someone tried to murder Senator Morrison for his gold? I'm saying someone succeeded eventually, just not according to the original plan. Natural causes can be arranged if you know the right people and have enough time. But the gold's location was supposed to remain a secret. When word leaked that it might be here, the bandit shrugged as much as his bonds would. Marco stood slow, his mind processing the implication. Who is your employer? The bandit's smile was cold and knowing. Judge Harrington of the Territorial Court. A man who has never lost a case, never faced challenge to his authority, and never failed to collect what he considers the name hit a physical. Judge Harrington was known throughout the territory as a man of impeccable will. If he was involved in corruption, murder, then the very foundations of law and order in their region, Mayor Fairweather seemed to 10 years in his men. If Harrington wants the gold, then returning it will save us. We all know too much now. Exactly, the bandit agreed cheerfully, which is why my employer sent me with instructions to ensure that, regardless of whether the gold is recovered, no witnesses remain to discuss its temporary residence in Copper Ridge. The crowd began to stir with real fear now. These were people who had come to watch an acrobat perform, not to learn that their lives were forfeit due to their mayor's secret dealings with stolen wealth. Marco raised his hand for silence. There is another option. All eyes turned to him, and Elizabeth stepped closer. What option? We don't return the gold to Judge Harrington, Marco. We return it to its rightful owners, the orphans of the Territorial Orphanage. But more than that, we ensure that Judge Harrington faces justice for his crimes. Old Pete snorted. And how exactly do you propose we do that? March into the territorial capital and accuse the most powerful judge in 3 territories of corruption and murder? Who's going to believe us? Marco's smile was enigmatic. Sometimes the most effective accusation comes not from words, but from action. And sometimes the most powerful people are the most vulnerable to exposure precisely because they believe themselves untouchable. Elizabeth studied Marco's intently. You have a plan. I have the beginning of a plan, Marco corrected, but it will require courage from everyone here, and it will involve considerable risk. The mayor stepped forward, his voice heavy with guilt and determination. If there's a way to make this right, to protect this town, and ensure that those orphans receive what's rightfully theirs, then I'm willing to face whatever consequences come my way. Marco nodded approvingly. The first step is to secure the gold and move it to a location where Judge Harrington's agents cannot easily. The second step is to gather evidence of his involvement in Senator Morrison's death and the theft of the orphanage fund. And the third step? Elizabeth asked. Marco's eyes gleamed with something that might have been anticipation. The third step involves giving Judge Harrington exactly what he wants, but not in the way he expects to receive it. Over the next several hours, as the night deepened and the stars wheeled overhead, the citizens of Copper Ridge found themselves part of an elaborate plan that would either save their community or doom it. And Marco's proposal was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its potential consequences. The gold hidden in a cave system that Mayor Fairweather had discovered during a hunting would indeed be moved, but instead of being taken to a place of safety, it would be transported directly to the territorial capital courthouse where Judge Harrington presided over his. You want to deliver the gold to Elizabeth? Incredulous when Marco explained that. Not exactly. I want to deliver it to the orphanage, publicly and ceremoniously, with Judge Harrington present to witness the donation. But the gold we deliver will not be the original shipment. He produced another item from his seemingly endless costume. A small leather pot clinked metallically when he set it on the makeshift table they had constructed in the town square. Fool's gold pyrite, carefully crafted to resemble the real thing. I carry it for certain types of performances, illusions that require the appearance of great wealth. Old Pete examined the fake gold with eye. Won't fool anyone for long, but it might be enough for the ceremony. Meanwhile, Marco continued, the real gold will be delivered separately through channels that cannot be traced back to Copper Ridge. Anonymous donations have a way of reaching their intended destinations without creating complications for the donors. Elizabeth shook her head. But what about Judge Harrington? When he discovers the deception, won't he just send more men to retaliate against us? Marco's smile is predatory. Judge Harrington will have far more pressing concerns than revenge against a small frontier town, because during that public ceremony, certain documents will also be made available to the territorial governor and the federal marshal. He produced yet another item from his costume, this time a thick envelope sealed with official-looking wax. The bandit leader was not as tight-lipped as he believed. During our conversation, he revealed several details about Judge Harrington's operation, including the location of certain records that the judge believed were safely hidden. The bound bandit, who had been listening to this exchange with growing alarm, suddenly struggled against his ropes. You can't have gotten to those records. They're in Harrington's private safe, behind locks that no ordinary man could breach. Marco's laugh was musical. My friend, you continue to underestimate what an extraordinary man can accomplish. Did you think my skills were limited to juggling and rope climbing? Elizabeth stared at Marco with new understanding. You're not just an acrobat, are you? You're some kind of investigator or spy? I am exactly what I claim to be, a traveling performer who has learned that entertainment and justice often require similar skills: timing, misdirection, and the ability to give an audience exactly what they need to see. As dawn approached, the plan began to take shape with military precision. The real gold would be secretly transported to the territorial capital by a trusted member of the community, Old Pete's son, Tom, who regularly made trading runs and would attract no suspicion. The fake gold would follow a day later, carried by Mayor Fairweather and Elizabeth as part of their decision to donate the mysterious windfall to the orphanage. Marco would arrive separately, ostensibly to perform at the territorial capital's Harvest Festival, but actually to ensure that Judge Harrington's incriminating documents reached the proper authorities at the precise moment when the judge's attention would be focused on the gold donation ceremony. What about the other bandits, Mrs. Henderson? The ones who escaped? Won't they report back to Judge Harrington that their mission failed? Marco nodded grimly. Which is why we must move quickly. Judge Harrington will know within hours that his direct approach has failed, and he will likely assume that force will be necessary to secure the gold. Our window of opportunity is narrow. Elizabeth touched Marco's arm gently. This plan puts you in the greatest. If Judge Harrington discovers what you're really doing, you won't just face prison. Men like that don't leave loose ends. Miss Fairweather, Marco replied, his voice soft, I have spent my entire adult life traveling from town to town, entertaining people for a few coins, and moving on before anyone could get too close. But sometimes a man finds something worth staying for, worth fighting for. Your courage tonight, your father's willingness to face his mistakes, this community's determination to do right by those orphans, these are things worth the risk. As the first pale light of dawn began to touch the eastern mountains, the citizens of Copper Ridge began to disperse to their homes, each carrying a piece of the plan that would either redeem their community or destroy it. The bound bandit was secured in the town jail, more to keep him from warning his employer than out of any hope that territorial law enforcement could be trusted. Mayor Fairweather approached Marco as the Acrobat prepared to leave for the territorial capital. Marco, there's something else. The reward I meant. Marco held up a hand to stop him. Mayor, there is no reward that your community can offer that would mean more to me than knowing that justice was served and innocent children received the help they deserve. But that's just it, the mayor continued urgently. The reward I had in mind, it might be something you'd want. Elizabeth joined them, her face curious. Father, what are you talking about? Mayor Fairweather took a deep breath. Marco, I was prepared to offer you half of the gold as payment for saving Elizabeth's life, $50,000 in territorial currency. The magnitude of the sum hit Marco like a physical blow. $50,000 was more money than most people in the frontier territories would see in a lifetime. It was enough to buy a ranch, start a business, live comfortably for decades without ever needing to perform again. Father, Elizabeth, that's an enormous. It's what your life is, the mayor ripped, and it's what this man earned by risking everything to save you. Marco stared at the mayor for a long moment. The offer, but the implications of refusing it. Around them, the few remaining townspeople watched with fascination, understanding that they were witnessing something significant. Mayor Fairweather, Marco said finally, your offer is both generous and deeply moving, but I cannot accept it. The crowd stirred with surprise. Elizabeth stepped closer to Marco, her eyes searching his face. And why not? You've earned it 10 times over. Marco's smile was gentle but firm, because accepting that reward would make me complicit in the very crime we're trying to correct. That gold belongs to orphaned children who have nothing and no one to advocate for. Taking even a portion of it for my own benefit would make me no better than Judge Harrington, just with better intention. Old Pete, son, you're turning down enough money to set you up for life. I'm choosing a different kind of one where my conscience is worth more than my bank account. Elizabeth's eyes shone with something that might have been admiration, or perhaps deeper. What will you do? Where will you go after all this is over? Marco glanced around at the faces surrounding him, these people who had welcomed a stranger and then trusted him with their lives and their community's future. I find myself thinking that a traveling performer might benefit from a place to call home, especially if that place could use someone with my particular skills to help maintain law and order. The implication hung in the air like morning mist. Mayor Fairweather cleared his throat. Are you suggesting what I think you're suggesting? I'm suggesting that Copper Ridge might benefit from having a sheriff who understands that justice sometimes requires unconventional method. Elizabeth laughed, sound of pure joy that a square. Marco Santelli, you continue to surprise. First you turned down a fortune, now you're volunteering to become a lawman? Sometimes the best performance is the one where the audience doesn't realize they're watching a show. And sometimes the most effective law enforcement comes from someone who understands the real criminals are on the ones behind back. And As the sun rose fully over Copper Ridge, painting the wooden buildings in warm golden light, the townspeople began to understand that they had witnessed something remarkable. Not just the rescue of their mayor's daughter, but the transformation of their community from a place where secrets festered in darkness to one where justice would be pursued regardless of the cost. The next few days would test their resolve and Marco's plan in ways that none of them could fully anticipate. Judge Harrington's response to the failure of his bandit mission would be swift and brutal, involving corrupt territorial marshals and falsified warrants that would force the entire community to choose between safety and principle. But as Marco prepared to leave for the territorial capital, riding Old Pete's fastest horse and carrying documents that could topple one of the most powerful men in 3 territories, he felt something he had never experienced in all his years of wandering, the sense that he was finally going where he belonged. Elizabeth watched him ride away, the morning sun reflecting off his colorful costume as his horse kicked up dust on the road toward the territorial capital. She knew, with the certainty that sometimes comes in moments of absolute clarity, that Marco Santelli would return to Copper Ridge, not because of any reward or promise, but because he had found something worth more than gold, a community that had accepted him not despite his unusual nature, but because of it. 3 days later, news would reach Copper Ridge that Judge Harrington had been arrested on charges of corruption, conspiracy, and murder. The territorial newspapers would report that his downfall came about through an anonymous donation of incriminating documents delivered during a public ceremony at the orphanage by a mysterious performer who disappeared immediately afterward. The gold would reach the orphan, every ounce of it anonymously donated through channels that could never be traced. The children would receive not just monetary support, but the promise of education, medical care, and real opportunities for their future. And Marco Santelli would indeed return to Copper Ridge, wearing a sheriff's badge that had been unanimously approved by the town council in his absence. His first official act would be to arrest the remaining members of Judge Harrington's criminal network using methods that would become legendary throughout the frontier territory. But perhaps the most shocking development of all would come 6 months later, when Marco would refuse yet another reward that stunned the entire town. When Elizabeth Fairweather, now the mayor, following her father's decision to step down and make amends for his past mistakes, would offer him her hand in marriage, Marco would gently decline. Not because he didn't care for her, but because he understood that some relationships are too precious to be based on gratitude or dramatic rescue. Instead, he would court her properly, with picnics and conversation, patient building of genuine affection. Their eventual 2 years later would be celebrated not as the union of a hero and the woman he saved, but as the marriage of 2 equals who had chosen each other freely, without the weight of obligation or debt. As for the reward that shocked the town, the one that Marco refused on that dusty morning after his dramatic rescue, it would become part of local legend. Not just the $50,000 in gold, though that was impressive enough, but the principle behind the refusal, the idea that some things are more valuable than wealth, that justice is its own reward, and that a man's character is measured not by what he accumulates, but by what he's willing to sacrifice for others. The children of Copper Ridge would grow up hearing the story of the traveling acrobat who saved their town twice, once from bandits and once from the corrupting influence of stolen wealth. They would learn that heroism comes in many forms, but the greatest heroes are often those who refuse the easy path, the quick reward, the simple solution that benefits them at the expense of others. And on quiet evening, when the work was done, the stars came out over the streets of Copper Ridge, Sheriff Marco Santelli could sometimes be seen practicing his juggling in the town square, the same spot where he had first performed for the amazed citizen. But now the balls he juggled were not part of a show designed to earn coins from strangers. Now they were a reminder that some performances matter most when no one is watching, and that the most valuable rewards are the ones that can never be taken away: the respect of good people, the satisfaction of justice served, and the knowledge that when the moment came to choose between personal gain and doing what was right, he had chosen correctly. The traveling acrobat had found his home at last, not because someone offered him enough money to stay, but because he had discovered the greatest reward of all is a place where your truest self is not just accepted, but celebrated. And in Copper Ridge, a man who could walk on his hands, climb impossible ropes, and juggle flaming torches was exactly the kind of sheriff they needed, one who understood that sometimes the most effective way to uphold the law is to turn the world upside down and show people what justice really looks like. This was the story that would be told and retold around campfires and in saloons throughout the frontier territories, the tale of the acrobat who saved the mayor's daughter, refused a fortune, and chose love over gold, principle over profit, and home over the endless road. It was a story that reminded everyone who heard it that in a world where corruption often wore the mask of authority, sometimes salvation came in the most unexpected forms, wearing colorful silk scarves and carrying juggling balls, ready to perform the greatest trick of all, transforming a community through the simple act of doing what was